Before you start this episode, due to some internet glitches, there were, I think, 2 minor dropouts during the first 8 minutes of the otherwise quite lengthy interview. One is just at the beginning, actually, with the opening banter, and then another one's on one of the first answers. But after that, when I noticed it was something that was going to repeat, I had Gordon repeat whatever he was saying at that point in time, and I've cut all the dropouts. So as far as you're concerned, after about 8 minutes in, you're not going to notice any dropouts whatsoever, and the rest of the conversation is as you would hope it would be. Okay, I'm here for another episode of Thorinquiry, and my guest for this one is going to be Gordon White, who is an author on notably topics related to the occult. I mean, in some sense, like, I guess, archaeology, one of them, in kind of tangential, one of them even economics in some sense, but I'm absolutely sure he wouldn't claim to be an expert necessarily in that field, except in his own niche. And obviously, if people are familiar with him, probably through his podcast, Rune Soup, where, again, similar kind of range of pretty out there topics at times, but collected under the, I mean, people would call them fringe topics or parapsychology, or they just go straight to the occult, you know, the classic terms. So this is my starting question for you here, Gordon. And obviously, by the way, I'll just say at the beginning, I definitely appreciate interviewing someone who is a podcast host, because you don't have to feel like all the things that could go wrong like they do in every interview, you know?
Yeah. We can always prank each other with that. It could be, I'll just drop out or go for a wander. You never know.
Okay. Right. So what I want to start with, okay, since you have the infamous intro to all the Rune Soup episodes, starts with asking someone if they were a weird kid. I mean, it's a pretty good topic because, to be fair, most people who have interest in the occult or these topics, you know, something captured their imagination when they were young, or they just, I mean, to be fair, it's actually something I have a lot of interest in myself, coming from a gaming background. A lot of the people who are the best gamers, you know, they had some reason why they were in their bedroom for 14 hours and they weren't with the high school prom queen or playing on a sports team. You know, there's whether it does, it's not required, but, you know, it sort of helps, you know, to get into that scenario. So my question to you is this: do you actually think, because it's not something I've heard you expound upon, do you actually think there is like a specific personality type that will just automatically be drawn into this area? Like, how much of it basically is kind of like a thing where someone sees the first thread and they pull on it, or how much do people in a way sort of almost get pushed into these kind of fringe topics, do you think?
Well, it depends. Because the guests I have are a mixture of practitioners and, you know, academics or authors or something working in these sort of fields that I'm interested in. And inevitably with the practitioners, there is something. And that has kind of been, the hypothesis was, I want to see how many people that holds true for, because it seemed to be true in the sort of 60s and 70s, some of the research about the people who were good at things like remote viewing. Jacques Vallée saw, for instance, things in the sky when he was a kid in France before he came to the US and started doing what he did. So I kind of figured there must have been some sort of inciting incident. But the other reason is it just kind of, it's really fun if people haven't been asked that before, or considered maybe there was a childhood impact on something that they've just done, like write a really strange book, for them to go, oh, I wonder if, as a matter of fact, some strange things did happen. And a kind of with a guest who hasn't maybe examined that, because inevitably we are the product of our past, distant past in the sense of childhood and more recent past. And it's kind of fun to watch people go on that journey. It also, just on a practical basis, loosens people up, especially if they haven't been on a podcast or something before and they're a bit nervous and they've got their notes ready, and the topic that they know best and presumably like best is themselves. So you kind of break the ice a little. It's a good first question, and I think most people appreciate it.
Okay, because the question I had along those lines was, okay, so I know that, again, I wouldn't claim to be any sort of expert on this topic. I've only read books on these things, but when you look into like anthropology of like shamanism and these sorts of almost, I mean, it kind of sounds derogatory, but old world forms of magic and the occult, etc., it does seem like in a lot of the cultures around the world, you don't really get to choose to get involved in these things. I mean, I know we have the wonderful luxury in the West of deciding to get involved in these things. You know, oftentimes either it's a lineage thing, you know, and it's like, you know, you have to do it because your grandfather did it and your dad did it, and that's what you do in your village. Or, I mean, you go as far as in some of the Amazonian tribes where I mean, for good or for ill, depending on the perspective of the person listening to this podcast, they essentially push mentally ill people into that field and sort of say, you're dealing with this sort of thing anyway, we think. And so do it as our, be the witch doctor or the shaman or whatever it might be, which again will seem very strange to some people. But along those lines, do you think that magic or any kind of parapsychological effects are any way enhanced or attuned to like cultural components, like cultural markers? Like if you are in a tribe like that, is the person who comes from a weird background and seemingly has some sort of something a bit off with them, are they actually the ideal person to, in a sense, have an innate ability to do that? Or would it be like duck off water off a duck's back, as it were? Because what I'm tying this to is I have actually heard from, I think people like even Israel Regardie recommended this, that they thought that generally you should work within whatever sort of the historical religious context of your background was. Like you shouldn't, if you're someone from a Judeo-Christian background, just go, right, I'm going to go into, the extreme ones would probably be like voodoo or something, something you have no historical. So where do you get on that whole issue? Because obviously it's a pretty vague question, but I think there's something.
Well, there's a couple of things. There's a couple of questions there. So the first one is, shall we say, Northwest European culture and its child cultures are the weird ones. They're historically weird and weird on a population basis. So approximately 11% of the world's population has this sort of monstrous mind virus where they think materialism is real rather than a 19th century premise of empires. So if you're born in the West on a sort of nominal basis, you are a weird kid anyway, because at any other point in time anywhere else on the planet, you would have been considered like dangerously insane, because you think the only things that are real are things that you can observe or touch with your hands, which is a mental illness. Flipping that to the other side, when you say, well, you're a weird kid, it's almost like there's an amplitude factor in play. So a lot of the guests I have on the show will have had experiences, and myself included in that, will have had experiences that are completely normal in non-Western culture. So in New Guinean culture, if it's like, oh, I spoke to my grandfather after he died or something, it's like, yes, and what did he say? Where did he put the mask that we've been looking for? That kind of thing. We find it abnormal. They find it normal. So there's an amplitude thing in play. As for people who are, I guess the word today would be neurodivergent, although there's tremendous problems with how we structure mental illness in the West as a result of being materialists. So you can kind of tell. In the West, since the 70s, there's been a big kind of, oh, I'm a shaman now, I've done a 3-day weekend in California. There's a rule of thumb with shamans, which is if they've picked it, they probably aren't. And I know that's a kind of extreme thing to say, but a shaman is a very specific role, and you are essentially a conduit between the spirit world and your tribe, and conduits don't have very good lives. So in that sense, yes. So what we're kind of talking about, the first part of your question, what I am looking for in a macro thesis sense across all the books of the show and so on, and I kind of talk about this with Dr. Kreipel and other people, is that famous McKenna line, if it's real, it can take the pressure. What we have at the moment, after 120 years of psi research, is a kind of intimation that there is a structural reality to what we would call magic, because the psi research aligns with the general kind of practices, if you will, in cultures around the world, from a telepathy, communicating with spirits, or altering the future in some way, form. So we kind of have empirical data to match cultural experience around the world, everywhere except us in the last 200 years. And that says to me that we can kind of head in that direction and sort of squint down at a improved metaphysical model. And it's important to say that that's new. That opportunity has only been afforded to us in the last couple of decades as anthropology has improved, and also a lot of the psi research that is, I think, is the smokiest guns has become available. Again, I've already referenced the Stargate program, but programs like that and kind of behind the curtains psi research that demonstrated that some very powerful and dangerous people took this absolutely seriously is the places we want to look.
Okay. And then the other part, I mean, admittedly, I should have split them up probably, was do you think there should be sort of like any kind of connective tissue between you and your culture when you embark upon? We're talking here not just about pure dabbling, someone who actually wants to get, like, they want to become, for example, if you're a kid from New York and you think, right, foodons for me, do you think there is essentially, even people involved in that tradition would usually sort of say, like, fuck off, don't come into this area, like, it's got its own path sort of you have to go down. What's your take on that angle?
It's an excellent question, and it's an endlessly fraught question for a number of reasons. I guess the main one, especially in light of contemporary politics, is there has always been a tendency to get very blood and soil ethno-nationalist in particularly Western magical traditions over the last couple of centuries, I suppose. You have famously people like Julius Evola who have that blood and soil ethno-nationalism. And arguably Nazism in general is this kind of transcendental metaphysical project to do with these kind of things. And a lot of people have spilled a lot of ink talking about how it kind of built a lot of its narrative based on 19th century Central European notions of building identity that's tied to place and who gets to belong and who doesn't. Because the thing about magic around the world is that it is very place-based, place spirits and so on. And when you get it wrong, you tip into some ethno-nationalist stuff. So that's the first bit, because here's the challenge, to answer your question. For some reason, it seems to work better when you do. Now, I think that is important information, I guess anecdotal, but in aggregate. I think that's important information to kind of go into this macro model we're building, which is, in some sense, it shouldn't be true. Why should someone who is born in Jamaica resonate more with Afro, or get a more satisfying experience and, dare I say, better results out of an Afro-Caribbean tradition than Tantra? Why would that be the case? And it is the case. And I think a lot of it, my guess at the moment, is a lot of it, particularly in the West, because it is mostly a Western experience. You don't find too many people in Peru becoming tantrikas, because they do in fact have spirit systems that they can join. They have their own shamanic traditions. So in some respect, it's a Western phenomenon, and it's not a ethnically European phenomenon. It is a Western one, because what you find, and I think the best examples are actually with people of Afro-American background. There is something about it situates you in your culture and timeline in a way that the West hasn't been able to give you, just as a general, cultural experience in consumerism. And so it's almost part depth psychology that goes along with it. So I had to do a similar thing. I mean, I'm dual citizen, but I've spent 8 years in the UK and so on. So my version of it was kind of exploring that ancestral. Was there a gap in my ancestral experience that I could behaviorally either interact with or learn from? And I think that's probably part of it, because for some reason it does work better and you do kind of need to do it. But the risk, and it's a persistent risk in, again, modern Western magic, that if you take it too far, you end up racist, frankly.
Yes.
And that's the challenge. And it also doesn't hold for everyone. So this is what happens when you're dealing with something like psi data. You have statistical significance, but you don't have 9 times out of 10. You don't have 9 out of every 10 doctors recommends. You have this shouldn't have worked at all, except we got a 52-48 response or whatever it happens to be. And it's a great question. It does seem to work better. It's dangerous. And why it works better for people in Western culture, I think, is probably quite significant.
Okay, because I have a follow-up topic, and this is what actually initially spurred me to think about this topic, which is one of those things where when you hear a great experience that someone had in this realm, I've noticed they oftentimes, they have to kind of control how the experience is explained. They don't really want it's not like, hey, just, got fucked up by some ghosts, AMA, anything you want to know, guys. It's more like, they'll tell you it as long as they get to control, I was doing this and I think this is what went wrong. So there's actually 2 people who you will be familiar with who had a negative experience working with another tradition, but I've never seen them ever expound further on it and let anyone sort of be like, well, what was going on here? Or, what was the background? So the two people are the comic book writer Grant Morrison and someone you recently had on your podcast, Jason Love, someone who's obviously an author on the topic of the occult. And I have to say the two experiences are connected, because essentially what happened was, for people who don't know his background, Jason Love, long time ago, when he was just getting into these topics, like many of us, was on the internet, and he was on the old Barbalith website, which was a fan page initially for Grant Morrison's work, The Invisibles, but then became sort of like a general magical forum, and, you know, people could have discussions there. And Grant Morrison in The Invisibles has this whole chapter where there's a Voodoo character, and it's quite clear, he even said it in interviews, that at the time he'd gotten a copy of the Gnostic Voodoo workbook by Michael Bertio, and he was working through sort of the wackier ends of it, you know, because it's Grant Morrison, that's kind of his style, you know, you go all into the different areas. And in the comic itself, there's a pretty negative experience happens to the main character, who's kind of like a cipher, a vessel for Grant Morrison's personality, whatever you'd call it, where he interacts with this scorpion lower god or whatever. And basically, as far as I can tell from the little that was written on a forum years ago, Jason Love basically, I mean, he obviously admired Grant Morrison, and he did the same thing. He got the book, he worked with it, he did similar things, and he also had what he described as a very negative experience. And I will say there's a very weird element in it, which is why I'm going to ask you about it, because it's such a weird topic that I don't even know if you could ask a normal person in the voodoo world about it, because part of the problem here is that book is not exactly a traditional voodoo book. Yes.
That was what my response was going to be.
Here's where it goes, okay?
Yes.
The problem is, specifically, the people that they were working with were, as far as I can tell, insectoid and spider/scorpion-based gods. They weren't even working with the traditional ancestors and people, you know. So they'd gone into a very weird sort of cul-de-sac, and then they had this incredibly negative experience, both of them, where they've both since said sort of like, you know, I stay away from that, like even said to people, don't go near it. Now, admittedly, this is a very, very niche topic we're talking about, but is there an aspect to which, if you go into these areas that you don't have any experience with, and it's not got any cultural background, and admittedly you're not going to, as a result, have a support network, etc., do those areas seem hostile to outsiders or people who are perceived as dabblers in terms of the spirits, etc.?
I don't think the negative experiences they had is to do with moving between cultures, because Gnostic voodoo isn't. Got to be careful with my words here. It is not the best exemplar of Afro-Caribbean magical traditions. So I don't think that's where the challenge was. Now, the other challenge is, well, the negative experiences then need to be modeled differently. Now, here's the thing. If you're doing this stuff, you probably have you've taken as read that the spirit world has some kind of separate ontology. Otherwise, what are you doing trying to mess around with it? If you look even just in European magical history, so the story of the grimoires. The story of the grimoires is essentially early 20th century pearl diving, because essentially early 20th century pearl diving, because the steps you have to go through to not die and actually get contact are quite extreme. So there's fasting and cleanliness and you know, hours of prayer and circles and getting the timing right and all these kind of things that you have to do correctly to get something to show up in a way that has, you know, a sufficient contact fidelity so that you can actually interact with it, but also in a way so that you don't end up as two little wisps of smoke coming out of shoes, right? Sure. So the thing is, a lot of people go off book because you go, that seems too hard and it is hard to sort of fast for several days and do all this kind of stuff. So they just kind of poke at it and they just sort of do the invocations to demons and see what happens. Something will happen. And all of a sudden, you're pearl diving without your pearl diving suit. And that is, I suspect, a better way of... There are definitely rough things out there in the edge of the other world, shall we say. And if you go toddling after them in a haphazard fashion, it's kind of like swimming at dusk with your leg bleeding. Let's see what happens. Let's see how this story ends. So... Okay. I don't necessarily think the barriers were ethnocultural in that sense. I think they were doing there are good and bad ways to pearl dive, put it that way.
Right. Okay. Well, here's the question I had that to lead on then from that is, when we talk about this aspect of like cultural basis for these things, or whether it makes it stronger, whether you have some sort of connection you can hook into, that's just kind of pre-made for you. You have the barcode that fits this particular scenario. The reason this is an interesting topic is that when you say Western magic or ceremonial magic, whatever term people are going to use, it's almost explicitly not actually from Europe or these areas. I mean, they always try to claim lineage to, depending on how far back they want to go, obviously like the Rosicrucians and then Egypt. And then depending on how loose you get in with the fact Babylon, they try to go back to whatever they're trying to say was like the magical force. So the question to that would basically be, isn't it kind of weird in a sense that that's like the main in vogue system in the West? Because wouldn't naturally we really have no connection to that in the cultural sense?
I kind of get what you're saying. Rosicrucianism isn't magic as I would describe it. None of those sort of pseudo-Masonic or full-blown Masonic orders, I think, they're initiation clubs, they're gentlemen's clubs. Yes, you can do a mail-order Rosicrucian Christian visualization system, but as to where Western magic comes from, when I say Western magic, I mean any attempt to practice it after the Enlightenment, because that's when our head trauma happened, that kind of we decided, firstly, that the mental and the physical were split, and then secondly, essentially, that the mental didn't exist or wasn't real. That we are sort of, that's a one-hand tied behind your back situation. As a result, it's led to a lot of milquetoast systems over the 20th century where it's all psychology, which, by the way, doesn't work in materialism anyway. So when I say Western magic, I mean pretty much anything that's happened after the Enlightenment. The actual magical tradition that does in fact go back to Greco-Roman Egypt and then before that Babylon isn't a sort of mouth-to-ear direct transmission, sure. But we can in fact look at something like the Greek magical papyri and see the same folk remedies, for want of a less annoying term, present in 2nd century Thebes, that is then present in 18th century Cornwall. And so we do, in fact, it does in fact go back to then. It's just not that 19th century pseudo-Masonic delusion of grandeur, like we're so old, we go back to this. The transmission was not aware of itself moving through culture. So that is, funnily enough, essentially how you cure the risk of getting a bit too ethno-nationalist with magic, is to get the history right, to realize that it's always been stealing from other cultures, it's always been a polyglot. As far back, I mean, my first book, Starships, was essentially tracking star magic and star lore back 50,000 years. And if you go back 50,000 years, it is big enough to then have influenced all world cultures, right? Okay. So the way you cure the risk of ethno-nationalism in Western magic is to actually get the history right and realize that we got the planetary system via Babylon, probably the use of circles from Judaic magic, although that's a bone of academic contention, and we got this most of the star lore and the decans and that kind of stuff from Egypt. And once you suddenly realize that it's this, and everyone was stealing from each other and blending in that kind of classical age. So you can't actually extract the fish back out of the bouillabaisse at that point. And that's good. That's the good news piece of it. The cure for the tendency to kind of get a bit blood and soil is to get the history right and realize, well, that's impossible.
One of the things that I find really a bit bizarre but very interesting about the world of the occult is how many people come into it. And so in order to get into this area, as you're saying, you have to sort of deprogram some of the materialist conceptions you have, like even some of the simple things that don't even apply anymore, like Aristotelian logic of like, is it true, is it not true? People obviously initially they do that. But then what's bizarre is when they immerse themselves into their chosen system, you can just plainly see a lot of people then just become religious about that topic. They become fanatical on that topic. So, for example, the best example to me would be like the OTO, because what's bizarre is these are people who I very much admire the work of someone who was an absolute iconoclast, who basically sort of like took systems, took apart the parts he thought didn't work or revised them, and yet seemingly they won't allow anyone within their own system to do any of that stuff because, it's like they feel like, it's almost like the Amish, they feel like there was a cut-off point at some point, and at that point, right, it was complete, no one mess around with that, and if you dare to sort of veer outside, you will be exiled, or they'll say you're a liar, you're doing false things. So what's bizarre is they don't seem to sort of be able to follow the idea that there isn't a single truth in a way, if you know what I mean. Why do you think there is that impulse? Because on the one hand, it's like they're out of it for a moment, and then they're clearly getting some extra benefit out of the new thing, but then they go back into it again.
Yeah, so it's a good observation. I don't think the OTO represents magic as I define it, which, is a culture-specific way of sort of enhancing probability. So when I say magic, I'm talking witch markets in Peru. I'm actually talking cunning people, that kind of thing. I'm talking doing certain behaviors or thinking certain things that will impact physical reality to your benefit, which is the thing that goes back forever, right? With the OTO, this is a pseudo-Masonic mystic club, basically, that likes to put on Gnostic masses in public areas. The thing is, it's a pre-internet way of delivering magical tech that I think I don't understand why anyone's in any orders anymore.
Right.
It's a pre-internet way of delivering magical tech, because you sort of had to join this 19th century German swingers club to get your copy of their version of what they understand Kabbalah to be. Same thing with Golden Dawn and whatever, because who else were you going to talk to in the early 20th century? Now that's no longer the case. So I agree completely that it does. I don't understand what it's for, but it's not magic. It's some form of mysticism or religious replacement. And my observations have been similar, that at least some of the more vocal people in it have come from some pretty Christian backgrounds, obviously, because it's Westerners. Yes. So there's clearly a psychological need for that sort of fixity of belief system that I don't resonate with and don't really understand. So it's a good observation. I just would say I wouldn't classify it as magic, the OTO.
Okay, because this actually leads into an aspect that it's very hard to unpack this question, but basically, since people have these experiences, and yes, if they're trapped in one of those frameworks, they're going to think there's this whole roadmap, and is it this I'm experiencing? They'll have all these preconceptions. Part of the problem with people who have the strong experiences seems to be that they then do, for some bizarre reason, almost like self-parody of like the Robert Anton Wilson thing of like you declare everyone else is a fake pope and you're the only true pope. They do tend to also simultaneously discredit the entire concept of magic by saying like, well, what I experienced was the correct thing. I contacted this exact person, but whoever you were contacting, that was someone different, and you're probably crazy. That's a weird social aspect. Like, what do you think that is?
I think that is magic functioning normally. And again, I would say that goes back millennia, because the reason I don't put a K on the end of magic, which is something Crowley did and tried to get everyone to pronounce it magic, was he was trying to make it appear serious. Like, no, we're not the kind of guy on the street doing the shell game or the three cards or whatever. This is a serious mystic pursuit. And maybe, but the reality is the fraud is, and has always been, the fraud and the fronting has always been part of it. And you just need to go to India to see that you will have fake holy men, real holy men in kind of turf wars, people with fake snakes, whatever you want. Sure. And that's one of the places in the world where you will get a continuous the continuous cultural presence of men and women who have magical powers. Look at me doing my speech marks. Yes. And in that is a whole bunch of fraud. And the weird thing about that is that the performative and fakery and trickery aspect of it is baked into it. We know this from, or we understand this from a psi or parapsychology frame. I've had George P. Hansen on the show, who wrote a book about 10 years ago, more now, 15 years ago, called The Trickster and the Paranormal, which is looking at the presence of trickster phenomena and why it seems to be fundamental to psi/magic. And also, one of the sort of manifestations of the trickster phenomena is people lying or getting sort of fraudulently performative, if you will, and in cases where they didn't need to. So, famous example, the Enfield poltergeist, right? I forget the name of the girl who was the primary victim or the primary experiencer of all this amazing and terrifying phenomena. She, all this stuff was happening in front of witnesses, so everyone knew something was going on. But she lied about a couple of pieces of it, and she didn't need to. And when the movie came out a couple of years ago, 5 years ago now, she was interviewed in the Telegraph, and she said, even to this day, I'm not sure why I lied. There was no need to lie. Everyone knew something was going on. But somewhere in there, she decided to make a couple of things up that happened to her. And she's like, I'm not sure why I did that. And so people like George Hansen have worked out that somehow that's baked into it. And you could speculate that if that wasn't her, if that was some sort of spirit trying to make people around them think that it's bigger or stronger and kind of anchor its foothold into our reality, who knows? But that's why you will never cure or solve people saying this is the one true magical system, and you're all doing something wrong, and I'm the reincarnation of Eliphas Levi or whatever. That will never go away, and you just kind of got to just be aware that that's part of not the experience, but that's part of magic doing its thing in culture, and you just don't listen to it, I guess.
On that topic, then, this is something that I have also noticed, and I didn't really have a framework to describe it before, which is that, yes, I mean, I've heard you talk about this before. There does seem to be a component of all really, really out there experiences that makes it so that if the person who has the experience makes the critical error of trying to honestly explain what happened, they will almost certainly invalidate the experience and look like they're full of shit. So, for example, okay, I mean, there's a great story Terence McKenna tells once where when he had that experience at La Chorrera in the jungle and he saw a UFO and it was really there, and it was like above the horizon and it shot off. When he got a glance of it as it went over, he later on looked it up and it was literally a very famous UFO that he knew was a fraud. So it's even that he himself in his brain somewhere knew, well, it's almost like showing me that this can't be real in the sense of whatever I would consider real, And obviously the other element of that is, I mean, he saved himself there by telling the story that way. But if he'd have just relayed the story and, tried to be as honest as he could and say, listen, it looked exactly like that, anyone who looks up the details and sees that picture is going to go, can't be real, you're full of shit. Whereas this is the problem, isn't it? It's somehow...
It's baked into it. Yeah.
I mean, it's not real in a sense anyway, but yeah, why is it important that they have to trick you as well in a way?
That's a very good question. Dr. Vallet's answer is that their primary target is culture. So whatever these phenomena are that can present screen memories and so on, their primary target is culture change. And he uses, because it's, he used this description decades ago, it's like they're adjusting the thermostat on the planet's culture. Now, part of that requires some sort of either fraudulent component or a bit that you can push the culture and then fold it back, and push the culture and then fold bits back. So you have a real UFO experience that looks like a provable fraud one. That moves culture in a very specific way. We have no idea why they do it. Why the sort of other side of the one-way mirror, as Dr. Kreipel calls it, behaves the way it does. But it probably has for a very long time, because going back to the pearl diving sort of metaphor or image for how grimoire magic has historically worked, the first thing you have to do when something shows up, essentially, other than bind it, but the reason you bind it is it will lie. And so once the sort of second half of any invocation you'll find in a decent grimoire is making sure this spirit will tell the damn truth, because otherwise it won't. So you can read through the historical documents and go, that's fascinating, because that unreliability and fraud component is what we find as a fundamental feature of UFO phenomena, and hence why I think Dr. Jacques Vallée is like the best ufologist that's ever lived, right? And I think his idea that the experiences may be fraud or they may be screen memories, but nevertheless, once the experiences hit culture, we can study that. We can study the experiences in culture because that appears to be a primary target. And that suggests that's another one of those pieces that needs to be kind of brought down into an emerging macro worldview that can cover psi phenomena and UFOs and bring that into alignment, not just with the history of magic in Europe and European cultures, but bring European cultures in alignment with other parts of the world where magic hasn't gone away. And there is something about bringing all of these things together that that's kind of the intellectual project that interests me most, I guess.
Because when you said earlier about the psi phenomenon aspects, and I would encourage anyone who's interested in that topic to look up people who are the real researchers. You know, they're not some person who's claiming something wacky. They're people who are literally sort of like, you know, I think this is a real thing. I've done all these experiments. Here's all my data. Make of it what you will. So they're not really trying to sell something as much. Admittedly, obviously, they're writing books and stuff. You know, there's a natural self-interest. But the people who don't seem fraudulent, you'd be shocked how much like coherent stuff there is there. So what I would normally say as a naive interviewer is, how do they keep the lid on all this stuff? You know, because I mean, there was that great Terence McKenna line that, you know, if like, you know, like he didn't understand basically how DMT wasn't like universally known by everyone. Because the idea would be, you know, even if not everyone did it, come on, surely someone would hear about it and then they'd do it in their group. I guess actually he just didn't know it was about 10 years after he died, sadly. But, you know, at the time he wondered, how do they keep this thing a secret? But this kind of plays into it, right? It's like you don't necessarily need the government to keep this thing looking discreditable if it naturally has that in itself, which in itself kind of begs the question, do these, whatever it is that's making contact, does it only want select people to communicate? It doesn't want everyone, basically. It doesn't want to be the internet and have everyone on it all the time. What do you think?
I actually think, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, the government is the biggest factor in keeping the lid on it in the West. But in some respects, it's pushing on an open door, because once you hit Descartes, once you hit the Enlightenment, you sort of set the clock ticking. The inevitable intellectual conclusions of Cartesianism end in empire and medical racism and materialism. They literally do. So we're sort of beginning the recovery process of crawling out of that particular plane crash now. As for do they want certain people and not? Very interesting question. Depending on, well, when you talk about, say, let's just call it the spirit world, right? It's not one group of entities that are in there. So you have all kinds of, I call it magic or shamanism extra-dimensional diplomacy, because you're interacting with place spirits, ancestors, other dead, other whatever is out there. And that's kind of why you need an expert, like you need a shaman in your village, because that's a full-time job. And that was like the kind of classical shape of what a shaman did, was essentially police the extra-dimensional boundaries of a tribe's life, because you needed spirits on your side for hunting, you needed them to not attack you at night, and so on. Now, that does rather suggest that some of them are trying to get in and some of them aren't, and I happen to know from personal experience that there is a particular delight in some of the more wild spirits in getting you to do, we're like sport, and getting you to do things, because in the same way it would be amazing for us if we could move, you know, a beer bottle lid with our minds, just like sitting there, to be able to physically do that. It's very similar for spirits, but except we're the beer bottle lids. They're as interested in the physical as we potentially are in the non-physical. And so there's a lot of manipulation going on, and we've been left wide open to be manipulated because we've decided it doesn't exist, which isn't a good situation to be in. And I also think it's why you get more of the kind of spectacular disasters, you know, the Grant Morrison example, because we toddle off thinking we have this under control. We have zero. That's honestly putting a baby in a spaceship, because these things, if they have any kind of reality, and they do, we're the least qualified on the planet to sort of have a bash at it.
Are you someone who thinks that even if someone chooses to have Like, for them, this doesn't exist. And in fact, for whatever reason, they think they never encounter anything weird. Everything seems nuts and bolts. It's exactly as they hoped it would be. Everything's in color. You know, people are people. There's trees. There's cars. You live till whatever, 70 and you die and you do a job. For the people who live in that world, is there still some sense in which they don't know it, but they are having influence over them from some sort of spirit world, some sort of extra dimensional component? Are they, no matter what, going to sort of be, in this case, just in the water of that without knowing how to swim, as it were? Will it impact them no matter what? Is it possible to completely live a life without ever entering your horizons?
I suppose it's possible. I think you find most people are just saying that because, you know, they read it in the Guardian or whatever. Like, it's actually just the sort of social pressure. And what's funny is the social pressure isn't there. You get sort of 4 or 5 drinks in at a dinner party, and the stories come out about, like, oh, my aunt came and visited us after we died, or this happened, or whatever. Like, it's basically at a 90% it up. There is, and I've actually had this discussion with, you're talking about parapsychologist, Dr. Dean Radin. He's been on the show. His latest book, Real Magic, if people are interested, is probably a really good place to start. He says there are like 10% of people, as far as he can tell, who have no psi capacity at all. And I find that fascinating. He says nothing will move the needle for them, no amount of meditation, no amount of whatever. And so, yeah, there probably are, and they probably always have been. But there are a couple of ways you can test that, and it depends how interested they are. The first is materialism doesn't even describe matter well. So if you're in that situation where someone would, and they shouldn't ever do it with me because I have a lot of practice in it now, but if someone would dare try and assume a sneering majority position from a worldview perspective, and go, oh, you believe in all that stuff, that's red rag to a bull for me, and I will embarrass them and make them look like the intellectual children they are in front of their wife and kids.
By asking them about what they believe in, presumably,
and
their
you just,
assumptions.
Yes, you hit them with the fundamental premises behind their worldview, and they suddenly realize they have never had an original thought in their lives, nor thought deeply than 1 centimeter, and are just toddling along like chimps, programmed chimps. But anyway, let's sort of aside the people who are on the edge of that going, oh, instead of you don't believe in that, do you? You get the, oh, are you interested in that? And that's the kind of, okay, well, here's what you can do. You can go and have an extreme psi event. They're actually very easy to trigger. They're just terrifying. So in my second book, Chaos Protocols, I say, honestly, if you took a Ouija board and a couple of friends and broke into an abandoned mental hospital overnight and sat there, with the Ouija board trying to do something, something will happen. It won't be pleasant. You will have the most terrifying experience of your life, but you will flee that building screaming 4 or 5 hours later, firm in the certainty that spirits exist. So I don't recommend that to people, but I'm just saying, like, you actually can. But you do need an extreme event to make you realize that, however you want to describe it, that's beside the point. 80% of the battle is to have an extreme event that you go, oh, we are living in a much wider, bigger, more significant context. You can be abducted by aliens. You can do the mental hospital thing. The nice one, coming back to McKenna and so on, is you can find a responsible shaman in the Amazon and go and do 2 weeks of ayahuasca. And you can come back from that and be like, okay, I don't know what's going on, but I can be quite sure that I was very wrong about my premises before I went away. And so people can be solved. And the other one, and for people who are kind of lazy, but that fascinates me, because obviously my parents are getting older, and my mother's an energy healer. She's fine. She knows that death isn't the end. My father kind of nods along with that, but he is in fact quite afraid of death. And what fascinates me is you could take a week off work and read about 8 or 9 books. We mentioned some of them, like the Psi guys and people who've done proper medical NDE research and so on. You could take a week off work and you could just say, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to sit here and read these 8 books. That's my week. And you will go back to work the following week and go, turns out we don't die when we die. And I just find it fascinating that 1 week's work is in between you and the sort of elimination of fear of death, and you don't even need the mental hospital to do it. So it's just the most amazing time that you would have access to the information that historically shamans and witches would have just crawled across broken glass to get, and it's sitting there for you for £3 secondhand on Amazon, and it's just left. And anyway, so that's the point. If people are listening, believe me, there's a couple of ways you can either think yourself into that state, or you can or you can experience yourself into that state, I guess is a way of describing it.
Okay. So one thing that I think it ties into before, the element of what discredits people, is that if you look into the biography, the life of any famous mystical occult-based character, I mean, obviously a lot of them, especially as you go back in history, are very weird people anyway. They are quite peculiar, and you get the sense even if they'd have worked in a fucking tanning yard, they wouldn't exactly just be a normal bloke. They've had something a bit off about them. But one of the problems I've noticed people have with encountering the personality side of someone who perhaps had power or a great understanding of technique is as soon as you get anything that's, I mean, in the case of someone like Crowley, it's obviously anything that's kind of like distasteful, maybe they are mean to people, that sometimes come off as an arsehole, Unfortunately, people, again, get drawn back into that logic of, like, looking for the truth. And so they're saying, right, well, if you really were someone who was enlightened or you had a mystical experience, why would you come back down to the position of being an arsehole to someone, basically? And if we draw this out in sort of a wider perspective, I know myself, if you have, so in my own case, particularly psychedelic experiences, for a few weeks, they seemed like nothing's ever going to be the same again. This is incredible. What's happened now has changed me forever. But if I actually met someone who was an old schoolmate of mine 2 months later and I just didn't bring up that part, they might not know anything had ever actually happened. Like, as sad as it is, you really do just come down to the baseline. And in fact, it does feel almost dreamlike, where like the further you get away from it, even you're starting to go, did that really happen? Am I just remembering a really good story there? And eventually it's just a good memory and you can't really experience it again. What would you say to this aspect where, on the one hand, these can seem so transformative, but on the other hand, it can also seem like you sort of come back into the TV show of whatever your life was as just this boring 2D aspect, Oh, look. Well, I would say that's two things. The first one is Crowley was not a pleasant individual, quite clearly. But if you take someone who was slightly better, like, say, Gurdjieff, he did the same kind of trickster thing that, I am not your guru kind of stuff, because it's trying to break people out of that natural tendency to do the OTO thing, to like get into some sort of, to swap religion for some other mystic or cultic experience. So I get that. As for the fact that you do eventually fade back into the grim inevitability of whatever your, day-to-day life or consciousness is. Yeah. Two things. Yes, that happens. That not only happens, but is described in a cultural sense. If you think of something like Gnosticism, any of the, dare I say, Eastern, although that's a bit of a challenge, the idea that you have to break out of this as Maya or illusion. It's there. That's I don't think you get to live in a state of permanent bliss, but what you can do, what you can teach yourself after it gets a few weeks out and you're at the point where you go, did that happen or am I misremembering it? You have two things there, which is it did happen, but also that's exactly the right moment to say, well, what even am memory? Like, that's when you can kind of start to use it to break things further out. Like, how does memory work? And specifically, how does it work? Because it doesn't work in materialism. Like, what molecules contain memory and how do they survive molecular replacement? So there's always a way to kind of break it back open. But if you don't do regular things, and this is kind of, and not everyone needs to, like, not everyone should do magic, not everyone should, it's not only is it a niche interest, it's like writing books or something, or being a novelist. Like, probably not everyone should do it, even though everyone has to read words, right? Like, not everyone should be a dentist, but we all have teeth. If you're not doing kind of daily stuff from a meditation perspective or so on, you'll slide back into it. And as long as you can kind of slide in and out of it, that should be fine. You should be able to slide out of it
when the time comes. So when you need to be the person, if your friend's parent or something has just died, and you need to be the person who can kind of let them know that you don't know what it is, but something else is going on, kind of thing. So as long as you can slide in or out of it, it's all good and seems inevitable.
Okay, in line with that then, since, it sounds like when I've heard you talk on all these different topics, some of which to some people would seem mutually exclusive, but you kind of slide between them and you find a common ground with the person you're talking to. When you do this, it seems like you're in a similar vein to myself, where you can have an experience and you can have things happen and certain elements of it seem concrete or like they suggest something, but there's an element of doubt there. You have to ask, how much of this was my mind, or how much was something. A thing a lot of people, funnily enough, don't actually follow from the old like Crowleyan tradition is the idea of test the experience. You don't say, oh, cool, it's this God and he told me all this stuff. So brilliant, that's all true. So write all that down. I'm going to be doing this forever. Even he himself was saying, all these things are to be considered metaphors or whatever, or don't trust these aspects as what they appear to be. So the question I have is this. It seems like so many people, it's the opposite effect for them. The experience is what makes them have a certainty and a sureness, and they want to repeat these things. And to get, whereas I always find myself going the other way. If anything, I think, cool, actually, things that I didn't think were possible could have validity. Can I question even the validity of that and go in a different direction? What do you think on this topic? Because it does seem like there's a lot of, I don't want to say true believers, because it sounds dismissive, but there's an impulse to that in some people.
So that tension only emerges from a sort of naturalist, materialist worldview, because you said a few words there that suggest your next step would be to interrogate your science of mind, because you said, oh, is this just in my mind? Is this all metaphor? Now, what that's saying to me is that your science of mind is emerging, and inevitably, because you're in a Western culture, is emerging from that Cartesian split where the mental is in some sense not real and the physical is. You won't find that in most other cultures. So when you hit that point, and that point of like perpetual, is this real, is it not? The trouble with that is that you've already decided what real is, and you're wrong. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So go with that tension. Is this real? And it's the same thing as I said before, like, well, what even am real? And you have to drill down and interrogate the science of mind that we've inherited because it's wrong. And then look at, and you do that via philosophy, but also comparison. This is where the anthropology bit comes in. This is where the work of Dr. Kreipel, for instance, comes in, where you can kind of barrel roll into other cultures that haven't had the same Cartesian head trauma and go, well, what does their science of mind look like that allows a dream to have an ontological reality that it doesn't, or an ontological weight that it doesn't in our cultures? Because we say it's just a dream. You're just imagining. It's like, oh, really? What is imagination then? Again, describe it to me materialistically on a chalkboard. And suddenly you go, well, actually, I can't. And all of a sudden you realize we've been set adrift without any way of thinking with the foundational experiences. Nothing exists before we imagine it. We spend not a third of our life dreaming. We spend a third of our life sleeping, and a good chunk of that dreaming. And we think that's fake. You go, that is the stupidest possible belief system, the stupidest possible science of mind we could ever come up with. It is truly demonic in a literal sense, as far as I'm concerned. So yes, I agree that there are people who will grab onto a life raft of certainty, and they'll grab onto it and stay as long as they need it, hopefully. You can't stay in permanent uncertainty. You need to stay in permanent, otherwise you do go crazy. You need to stay in permanent interrogation of what's real, what's mind, what's experience, right? So you'll have this profound encounter, whether it's through psychedelics or so on, and go, right, so this just happened. It was an experience. So what's experience? I now remember it. So what's memory? And it happened in some sense in my head. Again, putting speech marks around that. So how do I think about those things? And that is brilliant. That is a brilliant and necessary thing to do. And it's kind of the point of going on these experiences. But if you stay, I mean, everyone likes Bob Wilson, and I like Bob Wilson, but in many respects, his stuff is the shallow end of the pool. It's where you get in, but his whole Chapel Perilous thing. Remember, it's now 40 years old. It's not like if he was still alive and doing it. Like I'm a big fan of his stuff, and I still recommend it. But it is a product of its time. And we now have, this was all before Stargate program. This was all before this sort of ontological turn in anthropology. He didn't have access to the same alternate epistemologies that we do now. It's a brand new day for what's mind, what's memory, what's experience. It's a brand new day for people who are trying to climb out of that plane crash of Western empiricism.
Okay, on that line, actually, since you brought him up, invoked Bob, as it were. So one of the things that obviously holds up the worst from his writing is the whole 70s angle of like, just wait until we're in space and wait until everyone has sort of like super nootropic LSD type scenarios. And, you know, we're going to go everywhere. We're going to go internally. We're going to go externally. And, you know, it's that scenario. I mean, anyone who's for the first time you ever encounter the concept of an immortality pill, and the notion is, you know, well, the first one doesn't have to be immortality. You know, the first one needs to be, say, 100 years. And then maybe 100 years gets you to the one that's 300 years. As soon as you hear that, there's kind of a logic to it. You know, you go, okay, maybe, you know, maybe that could work. The problem is that does seem to have basically gone essentially nowhere. Like there's things leading vaguely that hint towards that. There's either nothing concrete or it's all kept very under wraps and it's just, you know, it's not for the plebeians, whichever it may be. What do you think of that aspect? Because this is someone where if you look at the actual experiential component of this person's life, they were having, obviously, one of the great syncretizers, you know, experienced many different cultures and aspects and seemingly had very profound experiences. Why do you think, as someone who, like, that's the thing, when you described it there, a lot of people would describe him as someone who, he did the first part very successfully. He got out of a lot of the cultural programming, and that's what a lot of his work is. It's kind of like, here's the breadcrumbs, you know, here's how you get out of Aristotelianism and basic physics and how you get, you know, and then try these other things. But the weird thing is, despite the depth of some of the experiences, it seems, and I can buy that they were very profound, he does still seem to be like a dude who saw the World's Fair and was like, holy shit, imagine when my version of this happens, you know, we're on the moon. And why do you think that aspect? And is there anything to the other side of that maybe that is something real and it's in some way suppressed?
I like how you put like one big question on at the end in a half sentence.
That's my style, I'm afraid. Yes.
I'll start doing that. Yeah.
So you have to be tempted either towards that one or away from it.
Yeah. So the thing about Bob Wilson is he was a jobbing writer. So if you aggregate all his stuff together, which has been done, you get collections and so on. So, you know, he wrote for Playboy and he was an ad man and whatever. Some of this stuff is written for money. Not the good stuff, but some of it is. And when he gets to that whole, that leery smile thing, space migration, intelligence increase, life extension, which is garbage. He's operating from a faulty science of mind. He's operating from Leary's science of mind, leaving aside the fact that Leary was an intelligence asset and he would get his LSD from intelligence agencies. If you look at his 8-circuit model, they're literally talking circuits and brain and materialism again. So anything that kind of emerges from that has some foundational premises that are unexamined. So yeah, like it's a mess, but it's a 70s mess of a stoner acid head who messed about a bit with Crowley and messed about a bit with yoga. If you see him as that, there's actually even value in reading his ludicrous utopianisms. Like there's value in it because you can kind of go, well, this clearly emerged out of his context and so on. Yeah, but it's the early stuff that is useful. It's the shallow end of the pool. It's just he died, or he also kind of at some point he started like playing Bob Wilson rather than doing any work. And the last couple of decades, last 15 years at least, that was the case. So he'd say the same thing every time, and it's that same kind of forced whimsy. He also had, which drives me nuts, for Americans have that, they occidentalize European culture. So his obsession with Ireland, and I don't actually think James Joyce is as profound as he did. And so you kind of get some of his Occidentalism and all that, and it's just part of who he is. It's still worth reading, and in many respects, although less so, that's the case with Crowley. Like, if you read them as real human beings, there's good stuff to get. Now, as for do I think out of anything in the smile theory is suppressed, I would say yes, we're very likely a multiplanetary civilization now. As for intelligence increase and life extension, no, but they are looking for it. I don't think they'll find it because, again, faulty science of mind. But the first part of it is clearly in play, that there are clearly alternate energy sources that allow some fairly zippy travel that we're unaware of. So yes, parts of it are suppressed, but I don't think the life extension intelligence increase thing is going to work. And it's funny, it's like early 20th century science fiction when you listen to the likes of Eric Schmidt or so on, that they honestly think that they're going to upload their terrible personality into some kind of cloud and then have it download on Mars into a self-driving Uber. And you think every part of that is like a child's story. It's that stupid. And so the good news is it's never going to happen. The bad news is they're going to try.
Okay. Since obviously I'd said in the magical realm, there has to be an aspect of, it's not about true or false or whatever, and definitely it's not about, well, if I accept this old premise, if the other thing excludes it or doesn't seem to fit, then one of them's true. Of, that's obviously another aspect people get caught into. How does that work when you put yourself in the conspiracy aspect? Because one of the things I've always found quite fascinating about conspiracy things is that beyond the people who will be frauds and disinformation agents or just have something a bit quirky about themselves where, it's about ego aggrandizement, etc., there is an aspect where a lot of these theories have a basis to them and have compelling elements, but seemingly can't all be happening at once. Or if they are, again, that suggests something about reality. So, for example, when you did the episode with, I forget his name, it's an Indian name, the guy who was talking about
Dr. Wickramasinghe.
Yes.
Yeah, Dr.
So when you're talking
to
this guy, he's totally open to the idea. Basically there probably is kind of like microbial life in space itself. This was like a classic conspiracy that, they block out any of these images on the space feeds, etc., and they take out like kind of the detritus or whatever, There's that whole aspect. And then, so maybe on a very, very small level of life, it has gone around the universe and come on comets or whatever it might be and traveled through. But then simultaneously, you have the other people who think there already are bases, places, and some of the things they say, have something to it. And then likewise, the idea that you could travel massive, either dimensionally or massive distances. How do you do that yourself? Like, are you again able to navigate between them without any of them needing to kind of ram into each other? Do you somehow, is there a coherence to it for you?
Well, the C word there is problematic. It's not fair, I think, to Dr. Wickramasinghe's work to use the C word, because you can kind of tell where you've had Western suppression because in other cultures it's not there at all. So the Soviets had no problem with panspermia. Same thing with the Indians. He and I spoke about it on the show. Like every other culture around the world was, over the course of the 20th century, looking at panspermia and which viruses and things came from space. And the only ones that weren't were the Anglo-Americans, going, no, that's all fraudulent. There's no such thing. None of that happens. And then, famously Arthur C. Clarke gets a visit from the CIA agent in Sri Lanka, and there's Dr. Wickramasinghe's book, and the CIA agent goes, we've known about that for a long time. So this is what I mean about there was in the second half of the 20th century a deliberate hit on all of this kind of stuff from a magic perspective and so on, because, well, actually it's a bunch of reasons, but it's not just microbial life in space. There are people, and whether you believe it or not, and I do, obviously, but there are people at senior levels inside organizations like JPL that have known since the 70s that there are, bombed out ruins on Mars and that kind of stuff. Like, why wouldn't there be? That was actually built into the planning from the start. So how you navigate it is the same way you navigate anything else. you interrogate it for things that can either be verified or corroborated, and they move up the scale of interest as a result. I think probably what you were getting at, which is also me, is so what Jacques Vallée says about being able to analyze people's UFO experiences, even if they're lying, even if they don't know what they saw, or even if they're describing it improperly, because they exist as cultural objects at that point, because their account exists as a thing that you can compare to other accounts and compare to science fiction and so on, right? So he's completely correct that you can it doesn't even matter if some of the people, and it's only a minority that have just completely made it up, right? It doesn't matter. Or it doesn't matter if they're misremembering, because obviously they're going to be. I kind of do the same thing with the more fun conspiracy theories, shall we say, like the world is being controlled by space spiders from Saturn and all that kind of stuff that has erupted in the last couple of decades in particular, just a blizzard of very out there explanations for what's going on. They can be interpreted as they can tell us something about culture in the same way that analyzing UFO experiences in aggregate can tell us something about culture. And I think maybe that's where you were heading, but I absolutely think that is valid, and it's a general indication of, I guess, where we are in the timeline.
Okay, a question I have is this. So I know within the occult community, there definitely is an overlap with psychedelics. I mean, some people will just openly tell you they use psychedelics to enhance the experience of the occult experience and to add lots of the things that, quite frankly, if you come from a Western background, you secretly want, which is you want it to be real and something to just appear in front of you and it to seem like, oh, it's not all in my mind. Oh, I know it's real. You know, sadly it is, you know, there's an element that's playing into your base desires in that respect. And you do want the comic book Doctor Strange experience, you know. So I know definitely in the occult world, there is overlap with psychedelics. But what I find curious is when you go into the world, for example, of conspiracy stuff, oftentimes the only time spiritualism or the occult overlaps is unfortunately the trend of people who are into conspiracies who are fundamentalist Christians, and therefore it's obviously the devil's running everything and it's demons tricking us all. And then in the other one, in the world of psychedelics itself, you tend bizarrely to only really get the religious element when they get caught in kind of the new age trap of, like, you know, it's crystals and energy and I've got to be a vegan for whatever reason, you know, whatever reason that naturally occurs. But I'm amazed by how many people in the conspiracy world and in the psychedelic world, particularly where they're having outrageous experiences that, you know, are paradigm shattering, how few people then seem to integrate or go into the aspect of occult and spirit elements, because you'd think, shouldn't these people almost be primed to be open to that sort of thing? What would you say to
that? Well, we'll separate that out again. So yes, there's sort of historiographic reasons why conspiracy culture is extremely conservative. Most of them are burnouts from ecstatic American churchianity. I don't even call it Christianity because it's not. And so you have as a result, there are certain villains that keep popping up that look like the villains of an ecstatic church. Yes. Freemasons, the British, the devil, Jews. And so you can kind of see that they haven't left a sufficient amount of their belief system at the door before they've gone on. They've gone looking to solve something that they haven't found. And that's certainly doesn't describe all of conspiracy culture, but there is a vocal component of it that is that, no question. When you get to the kind of why don't people in the kind of psychedelic world end up more full-blown occulty, there are a few places where psychedelics enhance the practice of magic. And one of the places that it doesn't, and this is initially surprising, is that sort of Solomonic method of evocation that I was kind of mentioning, the one where you in fact have to fast and be clean and whatever. It's great and this is my primary use my primary use of psychedelics is from a journeying perspective. So it's basically just, I ritualize space maybe more than a casual psychedelic user would, but then other than that, it's the Terence McKenna recipe, 5 grams in silent darkness, right? So that constitutes magic as far as I'm concerned. But in terms of practical magic, the other place you can do it, and it's usually for when you're coming up rather than coming down before you get too distracted, you can do things like sigil activation, because it's sort of easier when you're at that stage where things start to move, like your visual hallucinations. When things start to move, it's actually quite fun. You have the body high and the moving of things, squiggles on the paper, right? But it's actually not as good. It sounds like it would be good, but it's not as good for the sort of grimoire method of evocation, where you kind of do actually need to be clear-headed. So that may be a part of it. It may be that it doesn't resonate as much on second thought with more common practices. What you tend to have in the magical world is a high degree of sympathy and even advocacy for entheogens. So you have people who are interested in maps and obviously think that these things should be fully legalized and so on. So you have a high degree of sympathy in magic, and only in certain cases will you find that it overlaps from a praxis perspective. But the world's definitely Venn diagram quite intensely.
Okay. Well, on that track then, when you are someone who thinks about heavy contact experiences people might have under psychedelics, or if they are people who in the conspiracy world think there are other civilizations, perhaps they have contact with us, does that in any way tie into or mirror something you take from the spirit world and the occult world? Like, do these have to be part of something similar? Do they have to overlap in any way? Can they be totally distinct things? Like, can we totally have a spirit world, magic, all these contacts, things that operate on the earth in the occult world, but then if there isn't a civilization light years away, they don't actually have our version or any connection, and they really are something separate? How do you work with that?
So it's a really good question in a way. This comes back to the science of mind thing, right? I think, and it also comes back to what we were saying about amplitude. So I think the imagination is the spirit world. And I think it's the spirit world for the entire universe. And I think you have, obviously, and if you've experienced with entheogens, you would agree with this, you can have high amplitude imaginal experiences and low amplitude imaginal experiences. And I think that is the spirit world. And I think that's a baseline assumption, or premise, I guess is a better word for it, that allows me to model how intentionality will impact reality, because it does. And it allows me to model telephone telepathy and spirit contact. And it also allows me to model how a UFO will show up to McKenna in La Chorrera as a fraudulent picture of one. Like, I think that is the spirit world. And I think everything, and this is a Charles Fort example, and I think it's a good one. He sort of had this idea that everything exists on a spectrum of unreal to real. So I live in Tasmania. So Tasmania is further up the real spectrum than a unicorn, but is nevertheless a thing that exists because I can think about it. Sure. And in a way, it's an update of a pre-Socratic philosopher called Parmenides, who said, if you can think it, it has to have anything you think of has some form of existence, or otherwise you wouldn't be able to think of it. So my model, and this comes back to where I keep going, we need to interrogate our science of mind, because at the moment we think the interior experience of the world, let alone just humans, the interior experience of the world doesn't exist. And I think it's the thing that mostly exists. I think that's the majority of it. I think that's the iceberg below the waterline. And so all of that stuff kind of folds in, and that's the model that allows you to work with psychedelics and magic and psi results and so on in a way that is most satisfactory to me, particularly because there's more nuance to it, but particularly because once you take that as a foundational premise, you can look around the world at Amazonian cultures and Australian Aboriginal cultures and which say very similar things, that the universe has an interiority, which is what I think the imagination is. And then you can start to go, okay, well, does this feel more, what's our version of that? What's the version of it that we would have had we not had the Cartesian head trauma? So that's how I do it. It seems parsimonious to say it's all the one thing. I think the imagination is the spirit world, and it's an amplitude challenge to move between daydreaming about your favorite TV show and experiencing a 3D physically real Jesus.
Does that in any way imply some sort of, I mean, admittedly, once we get to this kind of scale and scope, you're not really talking about a real thing, it's conceptual. Some notion of like everything is some kind of giant monad type single thing that's expression beyond, I mean, presumably, I mean, again, internal and external are kind of worthless terms in the context we're talking about here, but yeah, everything is some, like, for example, is reality kind of like the outer bounds of the imagination?
Yes, that's a really good way of describing it. We
don't know it, you know.
I think we live on this. I think we live on the skin of we temporarily live on the skin of an evolving ecosystem or organism. I prefer ecosystem. So the challenge, and it's a very Western challenge, and Eastern in the case of Indians, is to roll this phenomena up like a little ball of Play-Doh and then put two little googly eyes on it and get to that monism. I think at the moment, I think an evolving ecosystem is a better view of the universe. I think it's more, or an organism, but it's a famous Bob Wilson thing, right? But like once you go, okay, so all is one, thinking stops. You go, is it? Have we not just lazily rolled that up? Like in some ultra cosmic sense, it probably is, but it's not the kind of belief system that allows for a robust epistemology to kind of experience life. So, yeah, I think so. Remember that materialism not only can't describe material, but we've given it over 200 years to describe consciousness, and it's failed. So people think it's a big jump to say, I think, everything, I think we are the outer skin of a spirit world. I think that's what physical reality is. You go, well, that seems like a big jump. It's not, because remember, the other one is completely wrong. So you actually have to go several centuries back before Descartes and look at what best practice sort of philosophy was then, and then it doesn't look like such a big jump. But if you're listening to this and going, wow, that's an extreme step, you go, no, I don't think it is. I think the extreme step is to say none of that thing is real, to say that 99.8% of the entire universe is fake. I think that's the extreme cosmology.
Because where I would, again, I mean, the reason why I was interested to talk to you on this topic is, like, when I notice whenever you move between these realms and you talk to the person who's into plant medicines and the person who's into conspiracy, there don't tend to be that much crossover. Like maybe as a mild hobby, they might have read a book in another, but a lot of them don't really have like core experiences from each they can kind of relate. And so a question I have is this: whenever you get to talking to the conspiracy person, obviously it's all going to be within a context of, is this information being suppressed? Do other people know this information and either I just don't know that or I've discovered it myself? There's all these parameters going around. But if you're viewing it from what we just described there, isn't to some degree all of culture and all of human interaction just some form of distraction from these kinds of concepts? I mean, it doesn't really matter what the distraction is. It can be Christianity or it can be Marxism. It doesn't really matter. In a sense, aren't all these things in a way to distract you from looking, I won't say internally again, but trying to experience things beyond the norm, as it were?
So it's funny you mentioned Marxism, because once you get to the Frankfurt School, they were trying to work out why there was no proletariat uprising, particularly in the US. Yes. And they use this awful term, false consciousness, which is to say essentially that the working class were too stupid to know what was good for them, and they were distracted by because they were elitist, so they didn't like popular Western culture, popular American Western culture, which was very black even then, like jazz music and so on. So I hate this notion of false consciousness because it's just that awful, like, I know better than you kind of thing.
Sure.
Now, you're not saying you're doing that, but whenever this is my problem with the Western versions of Vedantism and Hinduism that we get, like, it's all one mind and you need to see through that illusion. What we're doing there, and you use the word distraction, is we're projecting that false consciousness notion onto, one, the entire universe, and two, other people. Like, here's my counter to that. Is it a distraction, or does the universe wish to experience obsession with the Kardashians? Because I think the whole thing exists for the experience of itself. So this is the challenge where you go, oh, it's just a distraction. It's that kind of elitist false consciousness thing, and it's not something you said, but it's my eternal challenge at the moment. The long-term project is to elevate animism up to the same status as idealism or monism or so on, because I think it's a better match for the data. And so I have all these defenses against idealism, and the main one is that it medicalizes the universe to say that we're just in error, that we haven't noticed that we're all the one consciousness. And that is the sort of Frankfurt School turning around to the working class and go, oh, they would do an uprising. They have false consciousness, so they're distracted by cinema and Negro music. And you think, it's like nails on a chalkboard for me to kind of have that elite splained. And this is, I think, the fundamental problem with idealism, is that it medicalizes the universe. It says it's got dissociative disorder, but it also plays the false consciousness game with humans who, like us, are in some way other humans are like us, if the premise holds, a component of the universe experiencing itself. So, don't tell the universe what to do. Does that make sense? That's my answer to, is it in some sense a distraction? I derive, and probably you do as well, I derive enjoyment from thinking with these ideas and reading phenomenologists and so on. Like, I like it. Sure. Some people like, I use the Kardashians, but some people don't. This is a better one. Some people like professional sports. I don't.
Yes.
Because
this is one thing that it's hard to find things that are written on this topic, but okay, I'll give you an example. Okay, so in my world, I'm a journalist in the field of video games, basically. And one of the things I've noticed is, for anyone who believes that all of culture's programmed, or that, it's a very naive, it's almost like a Soviet idea of like a central planning office. It's like, right, culture this week's going to be about these music, it's already a bit of a naive conception. But okay, let's go with it for a second, that's like the straw man version of what they think. For anyone who thinks that, the problem is, I'm basically the one behind some of the mechanisms in my little field of the world. So, if I make a narrative about a certain player of the game or tie him to some historical aspect, I'll see that come back as a feedback loop through how fans think about him, or even the player themselves might take on that model, And the real issue I have there is, obviously, I'm not actually, as far as I know, getting anything sent down to me on, you should program the culture in this way or do these. It's just, in a way, I'm doing some of it consciously, some of it it's just happening. And then there's an element to which I can't even really fully control it. It's like the idea of trying to make a video viral. You can give it your best shot, and if you're particularly talented at certain things, you might get a few hits, but you can't make every video viral. You can't make them all. There's an element that seems to take over in the social. So to tie that into the point before, part of me feels like, okay, yes, if you look, there are provable conspiracies of groups who want to influence you or who want to promote a certain idea. And getting to the bottom of that is obviously an incredibly difficult task that many people have tried valiantly, and whether they succeeded or not, we can all decide. But there also does seem to be an element where, if you look historically at the people who've had these visionary experiences, so, the easiest examples you can give Westerners are people like saints, the guys who, what are they called, those saints that were like on sort of, they would sit on like a platform out in the desert. Yes. So there's these people, and basically, it's a form of like aesthetism, you go away, you're not around society at all. It's just you and whatever's going on with you. And in theory, there's nothing to distract you in that sense. I'll use that term again, from whatever the experience is. But that doesn't really seem to go anywhere beyond a certain experience in itself. And there's clearly an element to which, if you just put people together, they're automatically going to go to this, I won't call it lower, but, just an everyday level. It's just going to happen. You don't need to program people to do it. So clearly these experiences all have their own value, right? So how do you integrate that?
Well, again, there's two questions there. The Stylight example. So asceticism is interesting because it seems to give people quote unquote magical powers. That's why you end up with fasting, and fasting does things like improve dream recall. So if you've ever done intermittent fasting, you'll find that you have more vivid dreams and that you'll have improved recall. That's where I started on trying to look at the combination of asceticism and fasting. But if you look at Indian traditions, you have people who do yoga and meditation for ages, and they get siddhis, which are literally magical powers, extending the whole way up to being able to levitate and so on. And the same thing appears to be the case because the website has a premium member section, and we've been through a saints course quite recently, or the role of the saints in the European tradition. And there's sort of three ways you can be a saint, but the main one is some form of asceticism, some form of life denial that, and subsequently it turns out you can heal people or whatever, like whatever your powers are that makes you eventually become a saint according to the church. There is this asceticism component to it. Now, that doesn't mean that any of these sort of ascetic worldviews are correct in their description of the universe, but it does say that there is something about denying yourself things in the physical that gives you magical powers, again, for one of a sillier way of describing it, that is one of those psi phenomena things that needs to be baked into the wider model of what's going on, because this is where people have expanded too far from the whole, well, I sat on a pillar in the Syrian desert for 30 days and, now I can read your mind, or now I can see auras or whatever. Therefore, we should all fast for 30 days. And that therefore is incorrect. But the really interesting part is you appear to have activated a human capacity by denying yourself things. And that needs to be folded into their belief system. Now, as for like programming culture, there's a bunch of stuff to say about that. The first is going back to, I think the imagination, and it's not just me, I'm not just making this up whole cloth, right? So even Carl Jung, whoever you want, I think at least some, and probably the majority of the inhabitants of your imagination have an external existence. They're not your thoughts. They're just in your mind. I think in that sense, if the imagination is the spirit world, then there are notions and archetypes and so on that have an independent reality. Now, this is the bit that my struggle with my struggle with people who are looking at culture being programs, because it is, but not fully, my struggle is people don't get that if you see a motif recurring across modern Western culture, so suddenly it's in a film and then it's here and then it's in that and then it's in that, the idea that therefore this is being programmed by someone in a basement in the Pentagon might be, but if the imagination is real and it contains real things, then what you could be seeing there, and I think in most cases you are, is you're seeing this archetype or this thought get closer to the surface, if you are. So that's the universe behaving normally. So that's what happens all the time, even if there wasn't a Pentagon. But there is. And so as a result, you do, in fact, very clearly have manipulations going all the way from, remember, this is 1930s research from Eddie Bernays on, and you kind of again have an amplitude challenge, which is certain colors will do certain things, certain words will do certain things, and that will scale up to, and I know people don't believe this, but they should, that will scale up to where we are now, where you have the capacity of like full-blown hijacking of a human nervous system and controlling it like a meat puppet remotely. So again, you have a sort of amplitude from making people feel a bit uneasy to, particularly in the US, manipulating people by damaging their amygdala, amber alerts, and so on, like using fear as this constant wrecking, like punching on ice kind of thing. And then at this end, the sort of stuff behind the curtain really is as scary as that. It really is as science fiction as you can possibly believe. And people, again, this stuff's available to look at. People have been able to remotely insert thoughts into a brain since the 70s. Like this, it's essentially Cold War technology. It's not used as often as I think people expect. It's not needed as often because we all generally behave, because everything else down this line still works. But It's not the only thing going on. It's not the only thing going on because imagination is real.
If people take part in any of these different very wide magisteriums of techniques of consciousness alteration, and then they apply, as we're talking about here, like interrogation, I mean, admittedly, razors of rationality probably only take you so far, and they try and deconstruct it, or they ask, where does it fit into this worldview I have? A problem people are going to have, and this is obviously where some people go crazy, is they feel like they just lose any center. There's nowhere sort of they can rest upon. I mean, I'm reminded of that. It's one of the themes of that Colin Wilson fiction book, The Mind Parasites, is the idea that,
sure,
once you've been to the very bottom, like, what is there? And then in that case, there was some sort of, like, I think it was like human energy that impelled out and was actually more powerful and could win out, If you're in a scenario where you've had all these different experiences and maybe you can even conceptualize it as one huge thing, or again, your mind, I mean, to use the lawn analogy, I kept thinking, it's like, it is in your mind, but your mind's bigger than you think, so maybe your mind is everything as well. Do you ever come to do you need a point? Because I notice in a lot of the traditions, they do include that component of, you pick an ancestor to work with. You've got a guardian angel, whatever it might be. I mean, admittedly, these are very antiquated terms, but a lot of them seem to rely upon the idea that even if you can't find a center, like, you can sort of hold on to this thing, or this thing will direct you. What would you say in that context?
Well, this is sort of when we were talking earlier about people, we're talking about the Bob Wilson stuff, about people kind of clinging on to a life raft in the river for as long as they need it. That's fine, because it is weird. I would actually say if people are in the whole, oh my goodness, this, a lot of the stuff that was previously conspiracy theory turns out to be entirely true. Psi phenomena are real. Like, if you're kind of in that swell, funnily enough, 10 minutes, you can get the Headspace app on your phone and do 10 minutes of mindfulness meditation a day. And you'd be surprised how much you can kind of swirl through the chaos when you give your mind 10 minutes of just that. So that's my recommendation for people who are out there who are experiencing what you just described. For me, I like it. I like the chaos. There are certain techniques and spirit forms that I have stable working relationships with, but they're not a life raft. They're just, the primary value I get from them isn't stability, if that makes sense. I appreciate some people are more predisposed. I'm a chaos magician. I appreciate some people are more predisposed to having that kind of whirl of madness going around there. But if people are in that state, then genuinely mindfulness meditation and literally 10 minutes a day, and you don't need to be fancy. You can just get the Headspace app, and you'd be surprised how much you can. How easy it is, to just move through the chaos with 10 minutes a day.
When people discover any of these topics we've talked about and they feel as though there's any validity, like there's something there, that they're getting interested in, one of the initial things that I've noticed is a very common form of cognitive dissonance is to make some sort of a statement like, well, if this was true, then how come everyone doesn't know it? Or, I mean, a classic one would be, how is this being kept secret? Or, why isn't everyone gotten involved with it? Right. I'll use purposely a ridiculous example that a lot of people would immediately dismiss. So whenever anyone asks David Icke, why don't the Illuminati just kill you, basically? Like, if they can transform into reptiles and it's a matrix, why don't they just come and kill you and shut you up doing all these speeches and stuff? And his answer, I think, is actually quite an interesting one, which is basically along the lines of like, well, they can't, like, for whatever reason, whether it's some sort of mental or psychic frame he has, they just they can only sort of fuck with him to so much degree, you know, maybe they can manipulate media against him or something. Do you have a perspective on this? Like, if you do a podcast on a topic you are in some sense broadcasting things that some people might not want out there. I'm sure there are people who do want to control things and to what extent do you think they actually can? Someone who in any sense is self-actualized, what extent can they sort of put the kibosh on you a bit, and to what extent are you sort of, is it not possible to do these things? Where would you come down on that?
The David Icke thing is interesting. If they were ever to top him, they should have done it earlier. And it's not for the Queen is a lizard stuff. It's for the fact that he's been right for 2 decades on high-level pedophilia in the UK and
that's
the BBC.
A pretty good one at this point, right?
Yeah. Like the thing is, it's correct. Like he was saying the Savile stuff in the early 90s. Like, if they were ever going to kill him, it would have been for that. So I think he's fine. I don't think he needs to worry about it. But as for, I'll tell you that let's make this a wider question. In the 20th century, it was a lot easier to manipulate culture, Western culture, particularly American culture. Although the BBC is literally the voice of London in all the negative ways that that can be taken, as well as some of the positive, but mostly negative ways that can be taken. Because you might have had newspapers in every town, but you only had 4 newswires. You had 4 broadcasters. And everyone needed a license from the federal government to do these things. So even before you get to proven programs like Mockingbird, where the CIA have embedded people in every major publication and news organization in Britain as well as the US, provably doing this manipulation. This is a very 20th century way of doing things. And the thing is, they still kind of do that. It just doesn't work as well anymore, and we've seen that over in American politics over the last couple of years. Which isn't a pro-Trump statement, by the way. I'm just saying that all the kind of cracking the whip on platforms that have a declining audience that is sort of 40 plus and already going to vote a certain way, they don't know, and this is kind of Icke, and this is where I was coming from, they don't know what else to do because they believe that stuff. My background's advertising. And I used to have to convince people, particularly, media side of advertising. So I was working in newspapers in the sort of early noughties when we were trying to get people to pivot these ancient things to being digital. I knew it wasn't going to work, and it didn't, but it doesn't matter. So you'd have to sell to the higher level advertisers that just because you read something doesn't mean your customers do. Just because you consume that content doesn't mean your customers do. And I see that with the attempts to use 20th century culture manipulation, particularly in the US, which is, I would never watch a single or consume a single piece of American news if I was there, because the bits that aren't deliberately designed to make you scared, to actually fuck with your amygdala again, are lies, and they're lies to make you think a certain thing. And in some respects, it still works. It just works for a smaller audience of 40 plus people, and they're not the people that they need to do to make the shift on. So there are other techniques, but it does seem to me that there are a number of 20th century attempts to try and crack the culture manipulation whip that are less and less successful. And that's a weird, you can interpret that metaphysically if you want, but going back to the Icke thing, okay, so what David Icke says about the archons, this is bringing it all back to the manipulation thing, is the thing they're most jealous of in mankind is our imaginal capacity. So that creative thinking and interiority, what I think is the spirit world. And it's not inaccurate, but it's not the best read of the available Gnostic texts. To some extent, it's there in the Sethians. But it's very interesting to use that idea as a metaphor when looking at the really clunky attempts that we see to manipulate culture on multi-channel news platforms like CNN that no one watches unless they're stuck in an airport. And it's that kind of really complete lack of creativity, because you look at them and go, well, that's a lie. Like this statement that you see on NBC and CNN and MSNBC and whatever, like these are lies. Like they're an incorrect statement about Syria or whatever, but they've been told to say these words. And what's fascinating is you're watching it in a Wetherspoons at Gatwick against your will, and you're like, no one else is watching this but me. So you look at them and think, you guys need to adjust your culture manipulation. And so I have that work background that looks at it. So yes, it's very much a thing. There are much more insidious methods, but the Ike bit I find fascinating because you can use his Archon metaphor to kind of think with how bad and clunky some of the attempts we see happening now are.
Because this is something I thought was a closing topic that would be a good one to discuss, in terms of obviously the fact that since you're doing a podcast, that you're interviewing so many different people. I know myself, one of the reasons I do interviews is pretty much everyone I do an interview with, something they've said or something about them interests me. Like I actually think one of the problems you see with a lot of mainstream media interviews is they do an interview because the person's famous, or they think it's just the right time to address a topic, and you get a lot as a result of narrative elements that come in that ruin an interview. Because for me, the idea is, no matter how nuts some of the ideas might say, I want to hear the person out, and especially I want to actually ask the question that seems a bit weird, or pull on that thread and see where they go with it. So essentially, no matter what the perspective of the person is, I'm going to go with it a little bit. I'm going to see where this takes us, and I'm going to give them as full opportunity to give their own thoughts. So when you're doing this, and when you're talking to all these totally different sets of people, since you brought up the Ike example then, you gave an aspect. I've noticed, actually, when you talk about people like that who are very easy to dismiss to a certain type of person, like they'll hear an aspect of it and they'll go, okay, you know what, Gordon, even if a lot of it's true, some of it's bullshit, right? Well, here's the thing.
Sure.
I've noticed so many people like that there's definitely something to what they're saying, and there's value to it. I mean, even if sometimes it's just an idea, like you might not even think it's accurate, but it's a cool model, or it's an interesting way of thinking of something. But whenever it has that element that seems to discredit it, I mean, a great example I think would be that Guru Osho. Okay, because if you want to get just quotes, he has some amazing quotes. They're actually really fucking good. He's done a great job of like syncretizing some Eastern philosophy, but explaining it to sort of some of them might come from California and want to buy him a Rolls Royce or whatever, But when you find out the aspect that there's clearly a common element, as you talked about with many of the gurus, a lot of people then go, right, well, that's it. Shut down all the rest. We don't need to look at all the rest. Everything else he said was clearly nonsense. Whereas, I mean, I've noticed a lot of what makes a lot of these people have a sense of power and charisma is they've got some kind of a working tech, and they actually have had some legit experiences. And it just so happens maybe that guy was a bit of an arsehole as a person anyway, and then he put it all together, and that's, it's the whole thing. So here's the question. If people like David Icke have some value to them, and a lot of these people, whether we go with them entirely, there's some value to it, are there any pure disinformation agents out there? To even be a disinformation agent, do you have to have a little bit of the truth? Do you have to give a little bit out in a way in the secret sauce?
I like that. It's a really good question. I would say yes, but they're kind of easy to tell. So the Corey Good stuff in ufology, for instance, is like none of it is correct. None. The sort of, I was part of a space command, and the people who come up and say, oh, I was a teenager who was in a space command group that teleported to Mars with a teenage Barack Obama. Like, that's one of the primary roles, particularly in that area of research in ufology, is to make the whole thing ridiculous. So it's co-intel rather than disinfo.
Right.
It's deliberately designed to wreck an area of research by making it absurd. So yes, you will find them. You can kind of tell because someone will say something about teleporting with this elite group of teenagers to Mars, and Barack Obama was in it, and you go, that I'm gonna read past that, shall we say? Sure. Ike's a different case, right? So he is a very British kind of mystic. I like earlier Ike. At the moment, the last couple of years, and some of this criticism is valid. His historical unpacking of, say, the rise of Israel and Israel's impact on, global policy and global geopolitics is good because no one knew it. But some people who were previously fans of his have looked at it now and said, well, now you're putting Jews with lizard heads, and there's some bits of him that have maybe cynically, we might say he's trying to scoop up some alt-right audience. But so 90s, like, here is this guy who clearly had an experience in South America. He clearly had a extra-dimensional or becoming invincible experience that I spoke about before. So he had this profound thing on his trip, right, in his bus trip to Machu Picchu and whatever. And that sort of if you compare him to, say, Tom Cruise, like Tom Cruise is the American David Icke, and I like David Icke better because he's kind of got like a silver mullet and funny teeth, and he lives in a faded seaside town.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah,
it's
but like he's just British. He wears M&S clothing, and his teeth are bad, and he's got a silver mullet and a football injury. And you look at him versus Tom Cruise jumping on the couch, but it's the same thing. Someone's had a legitimate spiritual experience, and they're on their journey. So he's a mystic. Like if it was the Dark Ages, he would be some kind of hermit who would come down from the hills and wander into Winchester and shout that the end is nigh. But that's, that's what he is. As for, is there any pure disinformation? There is a lot of pure co-intel for areas that, pure co-intel. Arguably, probably the entire Steele dossier, for instance, is pure co-intel. But in our field, in the things that interest us, you find most of it in ufology. Less so, it's kind of difficult to defraud people who are magically operant from a magical perspective for too long, because they'll either try your techniques or they'll just smell your fakeness, and you tend to get run out of town. But you will always find it in ufology, because ufology itself is in many respects an op to cover the sort of behind the curtains build out of the what we would now call a breakaway civilization. But in many respects, ufology is entirely an op in the first place, but it's an op to cover a thing that happened. So, yeah.
Okay, as a last question, this is just a light-hearted one. If you could have someone who is at this point in time dead on your podcast, anyone, it can be from all of history, who would you most want? Who would be the dream guest? So it could be someone recent, or it could be someone from centuries ago. Who do you think would perfectly tick the boxes, or just something about them you'd love to have a chance to interview them for an hour, basically?
It's tough. My interests are kind of, you'd want to go far enough back that they probably wouldn't lie, or they wouldn't have any need to. And it's because you think, oh, well, maybe some of the people around the early stages of the Apollo program, where it is possible that certain things had happened. So, or I'm gonna pull back from the 20th century. You'd either do someone like Ptolemy, who was a 2nd century astrologer at the Library of Alexandria. So you do someone like that, because first question is, where the fuck is the library? We haven't been able to find it. So I'd probably pick someone like that, or I'd pick someone reasonably prominent in, say, the grimoire tradition, so maybe Dr. Rudd, because there are people who are sort of on the edge of there's the opportunity personally to learn some things that would cross a lot of T's and dot a lot of I's. So it might be Ptolemy, a 2nd century Egyptian astrologer, or Dr. Rudd. Otherwise I'm thinking of saints like St. Francis, maybe, or Hildegard of Bingen. It'd be someone along that line. It'd be someone along the kind of line of mysticism and grimoire magic, I'd expect, rather than, I don't think there's anyone in history who has like the secret answer that we need,
Right.
if that makes
So
sense.
it's more just trivia. You want to know some specific.
I wouldn't say it's trivia. I'd say some of that information would be quite significant. But yes, I don't think someone was killed who has like the answer to where all the flying saucers are hidden, if that makes sense.